the recording. Say it's recording. Oh, you've got it.
It is. Good job, Dave.
I just have to mute myself now.
Gordon's on mute.
Now can you hear me? It's my third time clicking on mute. Okay, Brooke, am I audible?
Yes, yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. All right, my name is Gordon Wilson, and my colleague Brooke Tasha and I will be giving you a presentation. The sequence of the presentation, I'll be giving you some background about the coronavirus pandemic as it has affected utilities in Washington. It's kind of the basic sequence of events. And then we'll give you the results of a survey we did of a group of utilities in the state. And our main purpose in offering this was to get some real data. You know, everybody's been interested in what this means, and we've all been speculating about what it might logically mean. But we wanted to find out by talking to people what's actually been happening. So that's the heart of the presentation. Actually, Brooke will be walking you through the impact on the different actions that utilities have been taking, as well as quantifying the impacts. And then she'll hand it back to me, and I'll be talking about the expense side, and then also some general fund impacts for cities and counties in which utilities exist. That's part of the context. And then finally, some lessons learned. So let's go ahead and I'll just give you a brief timeline, just because it seems like forever ago. But last January, we saw our first state, coronavirus, COVID-19 case in the state, and the first death was in February. At the end of February, the governor declared a state of emergency. And by the time we got to March, it was pretty much in full bloom. We had gatherings of over 250 people were banned in counties in the Puget Sound area, and then eventually schools were closed, and then eventually statewide, and then restaurants had to close, and gatherings over 50 were banned just a few days after that. And then we had a statewide stay-at-home order in March, and that lasted for a little while. There was a gradual phasing plan for reopening depending on the outcomes of testing. And that's the plan we're still in right now. As of July, the phase advancement was paused. However, as of a few weeks ago, some counties have moved from phase 1A, or whatever that is, and modified phase 1 to phase 2. So there has been some progress. And the incidence of the disease has varied from place to place within the state. Yakima was hit hard. King County started to tail off, and then just this week started to spike again. So some schools have declared remote school through the beginning of January. It's just a moving target. And that's the nature of an infectious disease pandemic. The governor issued a mandate, and it originally extended to, it was originally to July, then it got extended to October 15th, and then just recently got extended to the end of the year. This has to do with utilities, water, sewer, stormwater, solid waste, electricity. One thing is no disconnections or shutoffs during this period, and no late fees or payment required for the reconnection of services. And those are mandatory. There are some other actions that were strongly encouraged. The governor recommended that we offer flexible credit and collection procedures, and that we coordinate with the Department of Commerce to help customers gain access to federal funding for their utility bills, and that we employ internal processes to facilitate social distancing, including closing our public facilities to the public in order to minimize the risk of transmission within our offices. So that's the governor's mandate. In order to figure out what was going on out there, a few months ago, Brooke and I did a survey of local utilities. These were utilities we were familiar with because they were our former clients and we knew we could get access to the data. We got 11 responses from 11 utilities, and we asked them questions about the actions and the actions they had taken and the impacts on them. And that responses to those resulted in a lot of the examples and data points that we'll be talking about. Included the city of Anacortes and Bellingham, Kelso, Lake Haven Water and Sewer District, Mukilteo Water and Wastewater District, Pasco, Pierce County Sewer, Sequim, Skagit PUD, and Snohomish and Wenatchee. Most of them had water and or sewer utilities. A few reported on stormwater utilities, and one reported on a solid waste utility. We did not solicit data for electric utilities, but there might be some similarities. And if anybody wants to, we can send you a copy of the survey that we asked. If anybody wants to add more data points to it, that would be a good, welcome to either update it or expand it. So right now I'm going to turn it over to Brooke.
All right, thanks, Gordon. So as we gathered this information, we really tried to separate the COVID responses or the actions from the revenue and the expense impacts. So what we'll talk about here first are really some of the more common responses of utilities. So we know, as Gordon mentioned, again, all utilities kind of based on that governor's proclamation. And I apologize for the old date in the slide. As Gordon mentioned, it was extended to the end of the year. I know there was a chat question about that, December 31st as of now. But because of that, utilities had to halt the disconnects and discontinue late fees. However, some utilities plan to extend those procedures at least past the official order of expiration. So at the time, that meant that Pierce County Sewer had delayed any foreclosures until 2021. We may start to see that again, as these deadlines are pushed out, that utilities will continue to extend those. While many utilities already had flexible payment plans in place, some implemented new programs that didn't exist before or expanded the availability of the programs that they currently had to different customer classes. Another one of the responses that we heard was related to simplifying the application process for senior or low-income discount programs. Sometimes those requirements can be pretty stringent. So the city of Seattle, for example, isn't requiring any income verification during the ongoing pandemic. And then finally, to help encourage social distancing, as well as to make sure that payments happen whenever they can, many utilities are removing fees for credit card payments online. So in addition to some of these more common responses, we've also heard a number of the less common ones. So rate holidays are one of the less common ones. This is where utility would suspend all rates for a period of time to really alleviate customers' cost burdens. At this point, we haven't heard of any of those being implemented, just murmurs of them happening. So no confirmed cases of rate holidays at this point. Less common, but starting to become more common as we talk to more of our clients. We're hearing a number of utilities that are deferring or rolling back planned rate increases for 2021. Snohomish PUD is just one of those that has chosen to hold rates flat for 2021. Another action, go ahead, Gordon.
Sequim just did that a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, and I think we might continue to hear, this is budget season where they're going to kind of pull back on those if they can. Another action or response we've seen from a few utilities is to really try to increase the amount of ratepayer assistance funds available, recognizing that the need during this time is so much greater than normal. The city of Tacoma established an emergency assistance program with $1 million in funding initially, but after about 10,000 customers applied, they did increase that to about 2.4 million. And then the city of Sequim also established a COVID discount program that gives a 50% discount on the base or the fixed charge.
Brooke, I think you,
Oh,
there we go. Now we can hear you again.
that was weird. Sorry, I hope I didn't. So did I just cut out at City of Sequim?
Just for about 20 seconds.
Okay. Okay, so Sequim established the COVID discount program, and that gives the 50% discount to the base or the fixed charges. And this applied to both residential and small businesses. So continuing on with that same theme, we're seeing more provisions for businesses being offered. Pierce County Sewer is one that's made a unique change. So since their commercial charges are normally based on the previous year's averages, they've actually changed their billing structure to charge the businesses based on their current usage, really trying to just recognize that decline in use related to the businesses being closed. There have also been many grant programs launched. So both the city of Everett and Whatcom County and the surrounding communities have used federal CARES program dollars to set up grant programs for small businesses and nonprofits. The city of Pasco issued about $500,000 in rental and utility assistance. They used the home grant with an additional $1.5 million in small business support that came from a combination of their general fund and community development block grant funds. And although not specific to utilities, City of Sequim funded their small business rapid relief program through the use of the city's rainy day fund.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
Brooke? Certain things like just the change that Pierce County Sewer made to allow certain businesses to base their bills on their current year actuals. Somebody managing utility might say, oh, that doesn't make a difference very much. You know, it doesn't affect our total revenue very much. But for a given business, it could make a huge difference. You know, the impact is in the community is highly variable from one business to another or one residence to another. So a lot of these actions that we're talking about are a way of customizing the response or allowing individual customers to adapt.
Yeah, and that's a good point, Gordon. I know for Pierce County Sewer that they are largely residential, and so commercial wasn't a huge portion of revenue, but that change, as you mentioned, made a big deal for their commercial customers, and it wasn't ultimately a big hit to them. So knowing that utilities would have a variety of impacts depending on their own relief response actions and the changes in their customer behavior, we really wanted to see what those range of impacts was across that survey group. So while we didn't have data points to dive too much deeper into the class-based changes, in aggregate, what we saw was that residential customers did exhibit some increased water usage due to the stay-at-home order on average. However, the revenue impact still ranged from a decrease of about 7% to an increase of about 13% in residential revenue. Non-residential customers did experience reduced water and sewer usage, but the change was really highly variable by the type of business. You know, were they closed for a large period of time, only partially open, or were they considered essential? You know, a larger range is what we saw here, really depending on that. Most of them were really on the declining end though. So we saw that non-residential impact span really between an increase of about just 0.75% to a decrease of about 15%. So there's a lot of different oh, yeah.
Let me just add a couple of comments. One is that positive 13% on the residential. That is kind of an outlier, but it is for real. We checked it. The city of Wenatchee, their finance director, went back and looked at the data, and he couldn't explain exactly why. Maybe people started their spring watering earlier, but it's a real data point. The second thing is that these pluses and minuses are after taking into account the effect of rate increases. So if somebody had a 2% rate increase and their actual usage went down by 4%, for example, then we would say that was a 6% loss. It was a loss from where they would have been with everything being the same, plus taking into account the impact of the coronavirus, bearing in mind that weather also affects things. There are other things changing the numbers, but we did account for the changes in the rates. Okay.
Definitely. Yeah, thanks, Gordon. So as Gordon was just mentioning, there's a lot of different factors that really can impact the extent of those revenue shifts that utilities are experiencing right now. And one of those is the makeup of the customer base. You know, is the service really largely a residential area? Are there a number of large commercial entities shut down? And what about the economic makeup? Is there a large dependence on tourism typically, or is there a dependence on an industry that's been, you know, impacted negatively or positively throughout the pandemic? And then finally, does the utilities rate structure guard against revenue instability by recovering a larger portion of revenues through that fixed charge? Or have they made recent, COVID-based policy changes that might introduce some more variability to the revenue stream? So these are really all components that can affect the range of impacts that utilities are seeing today. So where we had it, we really tried to separate those impacts for each location between residential, non-residential, and total impacts for the survey respondents. So this first slide is going to show 6 water utilities and the impacts seen to their revenues based on those aggregate classes. The dark blue represents the residential class, with the green bars representing non-residential revenue impacts, and the totals can then be measured with the purple bar. And largely what we saw was that commercial revenues were down in all locations actually shown here, with the impact varying from about a 5% decrease in Anacortes and Bellingham up to just under a 15% decrease in Mukilteo Water and Wastewater District, Kelso, and Wenatchee. Residential revenue impacts were much more volatile, really ranging from a decline of about 7% in Mukilteo to an increase of 13.5% in Wenatchee. And as Gordon mentioned here, we did make sure that the revenue impacts considered the rate increase for a utility, just to make sure that we're recognizing they had some revenue impacts and from a rate increase. So these impacts we're seeing might be bigger if we take that into account. So for those survey respondents that didn't have revenue separated by class, we saw a range of total revenue impacts from an increase of just 0.13% or essentially flat in Pasco to a decrease of 4% in Sequim. The customer base mix and the overall revenue typically recovered from each class drove whether the utility saw a decline in revenue overall. And for many of them, they have, with the average total water rate reduction of about 4.7% since the pandemic onset. Similarly, for the sewer utilities surveyed, we really tried to separate revenue impacts again by those broad classes. So residential in dark blue, non-residential again in green, and then the total revenue impacts shown with the purple bars here. And we again saw non-residential revenues taking the bigger hit generally, with residential experiencing revenue impacts ranging from a decrease of about 4% in Anacortes and Bellingham up to an increase of 4.5% in Kelso. And the non-residential classes saw one utility with a slight increase of 0.75% at Mukilteo Water and Wastewater District, but others were otherwise trending down. So ranging from a decrease of just over 1% in Anacortes to a decline of over 12% in Wenatchee. And so again, for those respondents whose revenues weren't separated by class, we did see a couple relatively small positive impacts to the overall sewer rate revenues, with revenues remaining flat against this time last year in Sequim. So very similar to water, the overall makeup of the utilities class-based, residential versus non-residential, as well as the utilities rate structure, among other things like weather, will drive the overall impact to the utilities revenue. So in sewer, we saw less of an overall impact, trending down by about 1.8% in total revenues across the survey respondents. And this result, it may be because we typically see less variable revenue associated with sewer utilities, resulting in less variability in bills. So with much of the discussion so far really being around water and sewer utilities, it certainly doesn't mean that other utilities are immune. We did get limited survey data for stormwater and solid waste utilities, and no COVID related impacts were noted on stormwater revenues. These are usually the smaller bills that don't have a variable component associated with them. The one data point we do have for solid waste was the city of Anacortes, and they reported seeing an increase of 1.6% to single family revenues and a decrease of 6.3% for commercial revenues, for an overall decline of about 1.7%. So for this particular city, that was less than the impacts that they saw on their water and sewer utilities. So up to this point, we've been talking a lot about the impacts seen to revenues. So I'm going to pass it back to Gordon to talk a bit more about impacts to expenses and then the role of reserve funds.
Okay. Before we move off revenues, I'm going to add one more point, which is that our survey asked the agencies what their most recent billing period was and tried to do a comparison from year to year. In most cases, that was either June, sometimes July, a couple times May, but it was intended to compare 1 month or bi-month period from in 2020 versus 2019. In a few cases, we received data for the year to date rather than the actual, monthly data. So there is some variability in the time frame, but we use the data we got. On the expenditure side, in addition to offering enhanced relief to residents and businesses, there have been some other impacts on the operating expenditures. Sometimes there has been increased spending that was reported to us on supplies related to cleaning and sanitizing and personal protective equipment. Skagit, PUD, and Anacortes, Pasco, Sequim, Wenatchee all mention that. That's a common one. In some cases, there is also increased spending on new computers to allow for more remote working, like Skagit, PUD, and Pasco. Skagit PUD also reported some increased vehicle expenses due to employees traveling to job sites separately to maintain social distancing. A few utilities offered enhanced employee leave to allow for sheltering at home. City of Kelso and Lake Haven Water and Sewer District and Sequim all did that. And in the case of Sequim and Wenatchee, there also increased chemical and overtime expenses at the treatment plant, the wastewater treatment plant. So those are all changes. I just wanted to point out that if you do have increased costs that you can trace to your response to the COVID-19 crisis, it's good to document those increases in case they might be recoverable through FEMA, either now or later. Our best knowledge right now so far is that the lower revenue due to this pandemic is not likely to be covered by any federal aid, but increased expenditures might be, and it's worth documenting it and checking into it. The resources we'd suggest are the websites for GFOA and FEMA and the ICMA website for the International City County Management Association. So that's just a little extra comment. We asked also about the use of reserves, and so far the information we've gotten is that there has been very little intentional draw on utility reserves. Now, of course, unintentionally, reserves go up and down just as a result of normal operations. And so if you're not collecting your bills, then you'll be drawing on reserves. But there hasn't been one of these big, okay, we're going to pull $500,000 out of our reserve to deal with this situation. That hasn't been needed. Now, utilities reserves are useful in providing a backup for the mandated steps of waiving shutoffs and late payments. And if you're considering fully waiving rates, then be sure to be aware of and check out the specifics of your bond covenants, and in case there's a conflict, and also the gift of public funds restrictions. But in general, most of the people we've been talking to haven't been fully waiving rates, except as part of the collections process and when needed. The changes, here's another observation, the changes in the customer water use behavior can impact revenue beyond the short-term ability to pay issues for both water and sewer. And in addition, when receivables turn into write-offs, this can affect the reserve picture too. In fact, this is one of the bigger concerns that I detected from some of the people that we heard back from, which is it's not as though their booked revenue has been dropping as all that much or enough to make them worry. But if you don't actually collect that revenue, then you have to go back and write it off. It turns out not to really be to be real revenue, and growing receivables over time become harder to collect. An individual or a family in financial distress, if they owe 2 months of utility bills, that's tough. But if they owe 6 months of utility bills, then it's almost inevitable that you're going to have to cut a deal and offer some kind of waiver of partial bill in order to get any kind of collection. So the longer the governor's mandate, the prohibition on shutoffs and late payments, the longer that goes on, the more receivables and write-offs will become a growing issue, we believe. If you are facing revenue losses, there are three logical possibilities in order to rebalance the forecast. There are expenditure reductions. You could increase revenue through economic recovery, things can get better, or you can get increased revenue through rate increases. Expenditure reductions are a good idea, they're just not a new idea. You know, efficiency is always good, but you can delay capital projects that can delay debt or stretch reserve balances if needed, and there might be some O&M reductions possible at the margins. Economic recovery is always to be hoped for, but since we all forgot our crystal ball, we can't really count on it. And rate increases, of course, are very difficult because a bad economy means that customers are already hurting. In addition, response to revenue losses is tough because the information comes gradually, keeps changing. So utilities have to adapt and change strategies when needed. That's where a healthy reserve is a useful thing. It buys you time. Most of the people we heard back from in our survey, because they had reserves, didn't sound too worried. There are a few that were being affected, but they had the ability to adapt because they had a healthy reserve. But it does mean you still have to adapt eventually. Now I'm going to describe the general fund impacts to cities and counties. This is not to utilities, but it's part of our context. There have been varying impacts to general fund revenues from the cities that we surveyed. Wenatchee was expecting a $1.5 million loss, Pasco $2 million, and of course 300,000. Bellingham $7 million. It's a bigger city, of course, so $7 million might be more or less in relative terms. Sequim about $1 million. So these are big numbers for these for the general fund losses. The impacts on the statewide sales tax data showed that the sales tax got clobbered in the spring and then started to recover as the economy was allowed to reopen. And I've been thinking for quite a while that we kind of missed a PR opportunity when we the saying back in the spring was stay safe, stay home, stay safe, and we should have tied mask use to reopening. This is a mask up, open up. You know, that's the slogan, because the reality is, if we can go about doing our business, masks help us to do that. And if we can at least go to the store, then it allows many sectors of the economy to recover, even if tourism and travel are still clobbered. And we can see from the sales tax data that when at least a partial reopening is allowed, then the total sales taxes can bounce back up. And the state has seen this in their own forecast as well. So there's an initial decline of 20%, but a couple months later, it was it was pretty much back. Those impacts were more severe for cities than for their related counties. When I was looking through the data, I saw that, for instance, we gave two examples in this slide: City of Spokane, Spokane County, or City of Olympia and Thurston County. In each case, the county impacts were not as severe as the central city impacts on the sales tax. Tourism, though, was clobbered regardless and is still hurting. And this is what you'd expect. Travel and tourism is still, and it's not just as a result of restrictions, it's also people making choices to avoid unnecessary travel or vacations. So the tourism tax distributions were down by 2/3 compared to 2019. They started improving, but they're still down by 40% as of July. And this affects, in particular, communities that are dependent on the tourism economy. There are other revenues that are more stable. Property tax receipts are more stable, although there might be increased delinquencies or deferrals. The fuel tax receipts have been pretty flat, and they were down in May and June, but last year, but you know, 0.27% is not much of a change compared to something like the tourism lodging taxes. So let me offer some lessons learned. One is the point I made about delinquencies. Unfortunately, it's not over yet. And this is an example. This chart comes from Skagit PUD, but it shows how delinquencies grow from month to month to month to month. And like I said, the longer for any given household or family or business, the longer they are behind in their utility bills, the harder it is to collect it in full. And another observation is that the survey results confirmed our expectations. We thought commercial revenues would be hit harder than residential. That turned out to be the case. The survey also, we thought water would be affected more than sewer. Voila, it was. That's because sewer has a lot of fixed rate structures. Residential sewer is often a fixed charge per month, regardless of how much water you use. So it's just a more stable source of revenue, and whereas water bounces around more. Same thing, stormwater is the most stable of all. We also saw, and Brooke pointed this out in an earlier slide, that the impacts from one community to another can vary a lot on its customer base, on its economic base, and on the rate structure that is used for particular utility. In the survey, several of the staff responses said that the utility impact wasn't very large. And I think when they were saying that, they were saying, oh, it's not very large compared to the general fund impact. You know, it's not 20%. It's not $1.5 million. But when you really look at it, after accounting for rate increases, an average loss of nearly 5% of your water revenue, that's something that's pretty serious. Even the sewer, which was down 1.8%, that requires that you rebalance your forecast. So you can't ignore it, even when it's not as catastrophic as the sales tax or the lodging tax revenue. It does require something to be done in order to rebalance it. And again, because the story's not over yet, as late payments become delinquencies, those numbers might even get worse. Okay, some other observations that were made by people who responded to our survey. One is that the city's Quim said, knowing your community needs can help you tailor your responses. Pasco talked about the value of having healthy reserves. It gives you flexibility. Pasco was one of them that found themselves needing to invest in IT infrastructure. But because they had reserves, they had adaptability. Others talked about the value of the detailed revenue and expense tracking report because this thing changes so fast. Squim talked about the need to be prepared for unexpected impacts. They had a treatment plant compliance issue for the first time in many years, and it had to do with increased use of bleach and disinfectants by their customers. So they got a big slug of stuff to the plant that they weren't expecting. In general, this whole thing is a test of our adaptability, both financial and operational, and it is still going on. We are still adapting. So that's our presentation, and we're open for questions. And I can't remember who's monitoring the chat, but
Hi, this is Leslie. I'm your chat manager.
okay.
You do have a few questions that came through in the chat.
Good.
The first question was, did you do an impact survey on smaller rural towns under 1,000 people?
not specifically. We actually, honestly, we focused on who we knew, who we thought we could get data from in a more or less structured format. So some of the, we did look at small towns. We did, in looking at the sales tax data, we did compare the cities and counties that are adjacent to them. But, as we saw, the cities were hit harder than their surrounding county areas, but we did not ask about the utilities in smaller jurisdictions. Even if the economy wasn't hit as hard, and there's no guarantee that was the case, but a smaller utility often has a narrower margin of error. If you don't have bigger reserves, it's harder to redirect your resources if you just don't have a cushion. So that's the big risk with any small utility. You just don't have the economies of scale and the ability to cushion bad news. So that's the thing I would look for if I were zeroing in on the small utilities, but we did not focus on that in our survey.
Gordon, so Department of Health and Department of Ecology ran a parallel survey. It was both, I think, broader and less deep, but it did target some smaller communities.
Good.
If Janet Cherry would be interested in sharing.
Great. Janet,
Sure.
I saw you on the chat. If you're willing to give us some points from that, I'd welcome that.
Sure. So full disclosure, I was involved early on in the survey, but then had to step away. So I don't have a whole lot of details, but perhaps I can get some sort of summary report for the group to get posted at the IACC website. So yeah, hey, good morning, Gordon. Good to see you.
Hi, thank you.
Yeah, great presentation. So in May and June, we did a survey at the request of the governor's office, at Department of Health, and we joined forces with our partners at Ecology and Commerce, along with our on-site wastewater system. So I think we had about 240 respondents, and we sent it out to all of our public water supplies, our community water systems. So that's over 2,000 systems. And Ecology gave us a list. So the responses we received, and again, about 240 communities and owners of public water supplies, wastewater systems, and on-site systems responded. We didn't see a huge impact at that time period because they were just starting to realize some of the impacts from COVID and didn't have a significant amount of delinquent accounts at that time. But what was one data point that does stick in my brain is most of the respondents said they were going to deal with any shortfall by using reserves and delaying infrastructure projects. So those are both concerning because you can only operate in that business model for so long. So I really appreciated you giving the information on specific communities, and I'll look for that report. So Dave, anything else you want to add for your involvement?
No, again, yeah, I was involved and then not, but I remember that it did trigger or target some smaller communities, and there was a question looking at, communities less than 1,000. I was wondering if you might be able to add anything, but
well, when you're trying to rebalance your budget or rebalance your forecast, delaying capital projects is one of your options, sometimes one of your only options, but it is in its nature, it's a one-time type of savings. So are reserves. It can give you time to adapt, but you still have to either on an ongoing basis, you either have to hope for a recovery or make further ongoing changes. And so it's the challenge. I guess my point is the challenge isn't over, even when we've been able to deal with the most immediate parts of this, because the pandemic's not over.
Thanks. So the next question, is there a list of sources for customer relief that we could include in a utility billing run, both residential and commercial?
Customer relief sources. Interesting question. Brooke, do you know of one? I can't think of.
You know, I've seen a lot of city specific on city websites, let's say, that give links, but they're usually pretty specific to the city themselves. So I haven't seen, you know, maybe more of the kind of global links that would apply to everyone.
Right. A city that says, oh, we're going to have a, you know, X% discount program, that comes from their own resources. That comes out of their reserves. If somebody's asking the question, it might be, what sources are there from the state or the federal government? And you know, the information I've gotten so far is that there's no help from the federal government for reduced revenues, although it might be for increased expenditures. And the state, I guess you guys can answer that better than I can. David or Kathy or anybody else, but I don't know of a kind of a single list of resources. Other questions?
There are other questions. I do want to point out that Janet just posted some information in the chat. DOH has a customer assistance webpage to help utilities, and there's some more information being put in there. So if people are following the chat, that's a good place for that answer.
Yeah.
Next question. Did the survey hear from utilities that they are in fact delaying O&M, or is that a theoretical or future kind of thing?
No, not yet. In some of the respondents said, well, we've had some revenue you know, drop off, but we've been able to make some operational changes to save money also. So, but nobody indicated that they were doing any dramatic operational reductions. They seem to be inherent to the services they were providing. There are some cases where they had a routine type of monitoring program that got delayed, but that was some people talked about that, but it didn't seem like anybody was reporting on a permanent reduction in the level of service that was funded through their O&M budget. So, and I didn't hear of anybody talking about in my group, in the 11 agencies that responded to our survey. I didn't hear anybody talking about specific capital projects that they delayed either. So.
Great, thanks. Next question. Have you experienced any cities, towns imposing a utility tax in support of the general fund to offset the loss of sales tax revenue?
Yeah, it's a good question. Actually, that was one of the reasons I was asking the utility managers about what the general fund impact has been and whether the utility has been affected by the general fund situation. The answer for all of these 11 respondents, well, there are maybe 8 or so that were parts of cities, and the answer was no. They had not had the utility affected as of that date directly by the general fund situation. I was wondering if they were going to get hit by an increased tax or something like that, but that hasn't been the case.
Great. Next question, is it allowed, are folks allowed to raise rates during the governor's proclamation period?
Yeah. Yeah, they can. I mean, the governor said you can't. Governor's prohibitions were focused on how you deal with an individual customer who can't pay their bill. You can't cut them off and you can't charge them a fee for being late.
Gotcha.
But there's nothing that says you can't raise your rates, especially since raising rates applies to everybody, those who are hurting and those who don't. So it can be done. It's just hard to do in this climate. You know, raising rates is hard under best of circumstances. It's really tough at a time like this.
Those are all the questions that I have. Wait, we just got another one coming in. Does the proclamation relate to NSF checks fees?
I thought when I read it, you could correct me, Brooke, but I thought when I read it, it only applied to reconnection fees. You know,
And that's not sufficient funds.
Yeah, NSF is if insufficient funds. So if you write a bad check, then
I don't remember.
you get dinged.
I don't remember that being called out specifically,
I
Gordon.
don't think so either. You know,
That's a good
did
question.
It did encourage payment plans,
Mhm.
and you know, an NSF insufficient funds check is a case. It's part of, those fees are part of the cost of irresponsibility. It's somebody who thinks they have some money in their account, but they don't really, or they are either that or they're pretending they have money in their account that they don't. It doesn't. I'm not sure how common they are, but I think most of the time when people aren't able to pay their bills, they either just don't pay it or they talk to somebody. The thing that the utility billing people encourage customers to do is talk to us. You know, if you can't pay it, let us know, and we'll work something out. That's always the best advice when you're in a world of hurt economically, because the organizations to whom you owe money can be more flexible than you might guess if they know what situation you're facing.
Thank you. I don't see any more questions coming in. I do want to remind people that all PowerPoint presentations from the conference are going to be posted on the IACC website, so you'll have access to that. Thank you.
Good.
But I will note that in the chat log, there was link provided by Janet Cherry to the State Department of Health Customer Assistance Program resource website. And there was also a link posted to the UTC COVID help. I didn't follow that link, but I think that might be similar. So there's two links. I'm wondering if there's anyone in the room with CDBG that is knowledgeable about the CARES funding, because I don't want to say anything wrong, but I think I might have heard a rumor that it could be used for customer assistance. But if you like raise your hand or give a reaction, I'll unmute you.
One of our survey respondents said they were exploring that very thing, but we never heard what they found out. So if somebody knows, raise your hand.
Well, I don't see.
Okay. I see someone.
John Gallo raised his hand.
Oh, okay. John, where are you? Those J-A-I-O. John Counts. Jocelyn, I don't see.
I think I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
You're good. Yeah.
Okay. Hi, John Gallo, Department of Commerce, and I'm helping out with some of the community development block grant coronavirus funds. The first round is called CV1. And before I get into the CV1 CDBG funds, I think some jurisdictions have used their coronavirus relief funds, different pot of money, referred to as CRF, for some utility assistance for their customers. Some of you may know that. But for the CDBG CV1 funds, we are just sort of getting contracts underway for those funds. Most of our applicants are counties, and they've sort of formed consortiums with the cities and towns in their counties. And they're working with customer assistance programs, or I'm sorry, community action programs statewide to potentially make available what are called subsistence payment assistance. And that would include rent, mortgage, utilities, and internet assistance. So there may be, it depends on the county, some systems can access that utility payment assistance. It's sort of in the works, and we hope that those monies will be on the street soon. And those contracts will be sort of open for up to 2 years. And so we see an ongoing need. Any follow-up questions to that general information?
not seeing
Well-
anything in the chat.
Yeah, it makes sense. You know, utility assistance is a form of a social safety net that already exists. So in a kind of an emergency situation, it makes sense that somebody would pay attention to that and design a program that includes it. But you always have to look at the details. So I appreciate you making that information available, John. Any other questions?
Nothing else has come through.
Okay. Well,
Alright.
so we need to end the session at 11:15 so we can move on to the next one. But I'm going to be assuming that people are typing right now to get the questions in the chat box. So we'll hang out for another couple minutes.
All right. And if we see the number of participants dropping off, we'll know that you're done. Now we're down less than 70 participants. You know, people are
Dropping off.
deciding that they're done.
We had
All
a
right,
comment
then.
in the chat. So utilities such as PUDs and water sewer districts can be the subrecipients of COVID relief funds to help customers pay their utility bills. I had someone respond to me and ask if, John, you could potentially say more about that. I think we'll have to unmute John. John Counts.
Oh, all right.
Yeah, this is John Counts with the Washington PUD Association. And by the way, you know, I couldn't find the raise your hand feature here for us folks who are just participants in this session. So I don't know if that's something that is not built into this version of Zoom you folks are using. But anyway, yeah, this has been quite an issue with PUDs. And I think also with other types of cities that are not city or county utilities. We know that COVID-19 relief funds can be used for relief to customers. They can't, COVID-19 relief money can't be used to make up for revenue losses of utilities, but the funds can be used, and a utility, it could be a PUD, a water sewer district, it could even be, you know, a co-op or some other type of utility, can be used as a subrecipient vehicle for those funds to get those relief monies to the customers who can't pay their bills. So this is something we've established with Tony Hansen at the Department of Commerce, who's been sort of a lead person on interpreting what can be done with COVID-19 money. And so we continue to try to figure this out and try to make a case for you know, non-city utilities, for example, having access to these funds to help their customers. It's kind of an equity issue here because, you know, if the COVID-19 money is going mainly through CDBG Commerce to cities and counties, and, you know, so they have quite a bit of latitude about how they use that money, I believe. But then if utilities, other types of utilities, don't have direct access to that money, what happens to their customers who can't pay their bills? So, you know, we're trying to kind of sort this out, and we're trying to encourage our own folks to really work closely with their counties, especially to try to get these subrecipient agreements worked out so that a PUD can also, in a kind of a more equitable fashion, have access to this COVID money to help their customers. And none of the money can go to a utility's administrative costs. It can only go to ratepayer relief, to folks who can't pay their bills. And there's also another issue that folks need to be aware of here. You know, oftentimes the first thought is, well, let's run this money through community action agencies to those impacted customers. The problem with that is that most community action agencies have certain criteria for determining who is a low income individual for the purpose of qualifying for aid. With COVID-19, we've got a problem with customers who had jobs up until very recently. Now they've lost their jobs and they can't pay their bills. But because of the way community action agency requirements work, those people don't appear to be low income and therefore can't qualify for bill payment assistance. So in our mind, it kind of puts even more emphasis on this need for having these subrecipient agreements between local governments and utilities to help get this money to a lot of our customers who increasingly, as Gordon was pointing out, are starting to have problems paying their water bills, sewer bills, and so on. So anyway, sorry for the long-winded response there, but there's a lot to be kind of still figured out here about this relationship between utilities and the COVID-19 relief money. Thanks.
Thank you. I did have one more question come in the chat. King County is saying that all of their CARES Act funding is already allocated. Does anyone have any idea if there's any additional funding coming?
We've been reading in the newspaper about the negotiations in Congress about that. So far, nothing has happened, but I know there is an acknowledged need for an additional round of support. It just hasn't been agreement about it. That's from the federal government. I don't know about the state.
Thanks. I think that's it.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Thanks for being part of our session.
Yeah, thank you all. And Valerie, as the tech genius, do I have to stop and save the recording, or do I end the meeting and it autosaves for me?
It should autosave once you end the meeting.
Okay, I'm going to try that, and I'm going to trust you.
All right.
All right. We'll
Thanks.
see you all in the next one, hopefully. Thanks a lot.
Everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.